So today we're going to talk about making our purpose. This is a practical philosophy class. A little bit about me. I call myself a practical philosopher, and what that means is that I have a PhD in philosophy, and I am a philosophical coach, which is me using my training in philosophy to help people in their practical everyday issues live well. I am also a writer and speaker, and I have a podcast called Think Hard Podcast. And this idea of a philosophical coach, I sort of say this in all my classes, is both a new idea and a very old idea. Philosophers were sort of the original therapists before psychotherapy was a thing. Philosophers were sort of, if you didn't know what to do, or if you had some sort of personal problem, or you were trying to figure out the appropriate, action to take next, and you were living in ancient Greece, for example, you would probably consult a philosopher or a priest. And so philosophers have been doing this kind of like talking to people about their lives and helping them live well and thinking about what it means to live well for a long time. So it's sort of a revival of that way of doing philosophy. So as I said, I use my PhD to help people think clearly, choose wisely, and live purposefully. I specialize in helping moms grapple with what it means to make a human being, which is not a small experience to have. And I do philosophical coaching workshops, one-on-one in workshops, and I teach a course called the Meaning of Motherhood course. And I have some new thing in development, which I will talk about at next month's class. So it's very exciting. Okay, so today, though, we're going to cover purpose, right? And so I'm going to talk about what it means to live an intrinsically or inherently purposeless life. It's not something that we think about as being pleasant, but I want to talk about what that means. Why some people seem to have a strong sense of purpose in their lives while others don't. How to develop a deep sense of meaning and purpose in your own life. How to be grateful even for the most awful life experiences, and how to see them as connected to your purpose. And then I did not get any volunteers by email. Usually at this, in these classes, I will ask if anyone wants to sort of be a sort of participant in a little fishbowl here and get sort of extended, it's an extended kind of Q&A live coaching session. So you can talk with me and we'll talk for 10 or 15 minutes about whatever it is you're working with, and I'll ask questions and kind of show you a little bit how my process works, in this performative space that we're in. And then we'll do a Q&A where everybody can ask questions. And as I said before, this is being recorded and will be shared on my website and YouTube channel and those places. All right, does anyone have any questions before we get started? I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat as best I can. No? We good? Okay, cool. Okay, so I want to talk first about this idea that we have in our culture, which I'm going to call the purpose trope. And I think what that means to me is that we have this cultural idea that your life, as an individual purpose, it already exists, like in the universe, or maybe conversely within you, somewhere there is a true calling that you have had, that you are called to fulfill your purpose, and your goal in life is to find out what it is and to do your best to fulfill it, right? It's sort of like, what is your destiny? You've got to figure it out, you've got to fulfill it. And so I want to ask you, and this is going to be asking for a little bit of audience participation here. You can put your comments either in the chat, or if you'd like to come on live, you are welcome to just pop on. There aren't that many people in class today, so I don't think it'll be too much noise if you just want to unmute yourself and chat. But I'm going to ask you, so this idea that, there's this, you're supposed to find your purpose, and that we're all on this path to find and fulfill our purposes. One, do you think that's true? And two, what do you think the impact of that messaging is on us as people? So I'll give you a couple minutes to put your thoughts in the chat, or if you want to volunteer, you can just unmute yourself. McCartney says a lot of pressure. Yeah, I agree. That is the first thing I wrote. A lot of pressure to get it right. Yeah. What else? Rob says, as an achiever, purpose means having accomplished something in life. Achiever with a capital A, I like that. Pressure, but also realization that there's always something more to achieve and therefore a lack of contentment. Interesting. So it's that the purpose means like achieving something great or achieving something always, and that you can't just be sort of happy who you are, where you are. You always constantly need to be going for the next thing, for the bigger thing, for the better thing. I got that right, Rob? Yeah, okay. Emily says, as someone home with a 6-week-old, this sounds terrible. How does purpose align with the duties like caretaking, especially when kids are small? Yeah, exactly, Emily. So, and your six-week-old is why you're not on video, perfectly understandable. But I think that that's actually part of one of the big identity conflicts that mothers get into, right? Is that we have this sense that we're told, like, find your purpose, you know, like go out there in the world and like, you know, go to college or go explore, adventure, do different things and figure out what your purpose is in life. And then maybe you find it and maybe you don't, but then you become a parent and then suddenly it's like, well, how does this little being fit in or not with that other purpose that I thought that I had that I was supposed to find? And like now my priorities seem different. Maybe that purpose doesn't feel meaningful anymore, or maybe it feels still very meaningful and this doesn't feel meaningful. And like, isn't it supposed to feel meaningful? And blah, right? Like all of that sort of stuff. What do you think, Emily? Did I get that right? Yes, my purpose changes and I wonder if it can align or it has to be the everything. I like that. Yeah. Right. And so what happens when, because part of that trope, I think one thing that you've said there that pulls it out there is part of the trope is that it's like, this is your purpose, it is true, and it is forever. It is like not universal, but a immortal truth about your life. Like for as long as you live, from the moment you were conceived, there was like, bing, like some little star landed on your head and said like, thou shalt be a nurse or whatever your thing is, right? And so you have this sense that like, this is who I am, this is who I'm supposed to be, this is who I'm supposed to be my entire life, right? Okay, so and then if we failed to find out what that purpose is, or if we fail to fulfill what that purpose is, like we think it's this and then we, you know, get waylaid by something, whether it's experience or kids or whatever else, then we wasted our life, or that our life is somehow meaningless, or somehow like doesn't, I don't know, it hasn't been realized in an appropriate way. And so what ends up happening then is we often get sort of obsessed with looking for either external experiences or like flashes of insight that come from inside of us that will give us the answer of what our purpose is, right? That it's like, oh, if I could just like go and have this kind of experience, then my purpose will be revealed to me. If I can just like, I don't know, do ayahuasca or something, then my purpose will be revealed to me. Or if I can just go to the right seminar, or if I can just have the right experience, or if I can just meditate long enough, or, you know, journal appropriately, or take the right class, or talk to the right counselor, like my purpose will be revealed to me. And my quest as a person is to just like figure out what that is and then like work on that one thing for the rest of my life, right? It's a lot. It's a lot of pressure. As McCartney said, it is a lot to sort of contend with. And ultimately, if you feel like you haven't found what that thing is in particular, you can feel powerless if you're waiting for that flash of insight to come, and you're like, it's like you're wandering around the world looking for your purpose like it's a lost puppy, right? And I think, as Rob said, even if you feel like you have found the thing, it's like, if you don't fulfill your purpose and achieve in these particular ways, then you are failing, right? So neither one is great. All right. So I'm going to suggest to you today that you don't find your purpose, that this idea that you have to go out there and like get the flash of insight or go to the right seminar, that like that's, you don't find your purpose, you make it. That is what I'm going to offer to you today as a suggestion, and you can tell me, if it resonates with you, what you think of it. Okay, so how do we think about it this way? My understanding of this comes from the work of philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. I studied him for my dissertation. He's a French philosopher from the 20th century. He's often considered one of the like major figures in the existentialist philosophical movement. And he actually writes about this in his essay called Existentialism as a Humanism. And he uses the example of the translation is often a paper cutter, right? Which is like basically a pair of scissors, right? And he says that sometimes we think of human beings as if they were a pair of scissors, where we think like, I need something to cut paper. I will create a paper cutter, which will have the function of cutting paper. And that we think that as humans, we're like that we like that some being, right, if you believe in God, or some force in the universe had a purpose in mind for us, our role to play in the universe, and they thought that up, and then they created us to fulfill that role in the same way that you create a pair of scissors to cut paper, right? And Sartre makes the revolutionary claim, I'm going to make the revolutionary claim, that a human person is not like a pair of scissors, right? That in fact, human beings are, we don't actually have a predetermined function or purpose. We just sort of show up, right? We are just born, right? We are not like a paper cutter, which is made with a specific function or purpose in mind, i.e. to cut paper. Our purpose does not exist before we do, right? Before we're born. We're simply born, right? And the way that Sartre puts this is he says existence precedes essence. So what does that mean? He says, what is meant by saying that existence precedes essence? It means, first of all, that man exists, turns up on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. So we get here. And it doesn't really matter. Sartre himself is an atheist, so he doesn't believe in this idea of a divine being that created us, or divine intelligence. At this point, I don't know that it really matters if you do or not. But what he is suggesting that is, even if there is a God, that God did not have a purpose for you in mind when you were created. You just showed up. You got here through the accident of evolution, or, because your parents and their parents and their parents existed, and then here you are, right? Like, you just sort of show up. And human beings just sort of show up. And we show up with big brains, with the ability to think about our experiences and reflect on them, with the ability to wonder about our purpose, with the ability to make decisions and interpret the world, which is a really special part of being a human. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we show up with a predetermined purpose in mind, right? So I'm going to suggest that, like, what happens if you don't have a predetermined purpose? Does that mean that you don't have a purpose at all, right? And I'm going to say that no, you can still have a purpose, but you and only you get to decide what that is. And you actually, if you're going to have a purpose, you have to decide what that is. It doesn't come from outside of you, and it doesn't come from like a predetermined innate like corner of your soul somewhere in there. Once you can like excavate it, it pops up or something. No, it is in fact something different. You have to create it. So what I mean by that is And I should say that, you know, like I said, I'm going to go through this. Oh, good. So people are responding. I'm going to go through this. If you have any questions or comments or anything, please feel free to put in the chat, or even just unmute yourself and pop on and ask a question. Don't hesitate to interrupt me. Okay. So, so when I say what does it mean for you to create your purpose? It seems like kind of an odd way of thinking about it. And what I want to suggest that purpose, what I mean when I say purpose, is actually nothing more than the story that you tell about your life. That's what we mean by purpose. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you myself as an example. So this photo, if you are on my mailing list or follow me on social media, you might recognize this picture. I've posted it before. This photo was taken in 2015 on February 17th, which was 4.5 years ago or so. That is my little daughter when she was a few months old. And this photo was taken 2 days after I was discharged from Cedar Hills Mental Health Hospital psychiatric ward. I spent 5 days in a mental health hospital because I was experiencing postpartum psychosis, which is only experienced by 1 or 2 in 1,000 pregnancies. So I drew the lucky straw. The short version of how that happened and what it was like is that I was feeling very, new mom anxiety. I was anxious. Also being up and down and caring for the baby got me into this sort of insomnia loop where like I would be up, the baby would fall back asleep, and then I couldn't fall back asleep. And then I would be anxious about not being able to sleep, which would keep me up even more. And then I fell into this like cycle of insomnia. If you've ever been there, you know what it's like. It's horrible, right? So I was getting to the point where I just like wasn't sleeping nearly enough. I was getting 3 hours a night every night for extended periods, and maybe once a week I would sort of crash out and sleep for 8 hours or something. But it was just weeks and weeks of not getting enough sleep, my brain going into kind of overdrive, the anxiety going through the roof, and me feeling like I couldn't be left alone. I was afraid that I was going to like drop my baby. I was afraid that I was going to not be able to care for her. And it was really scary. And it got to the point where I just like kept going to my doctor and feeling more and more freaked out and more and more freaked out. And they were eventually just like, well, first they were like, try these drugs. The drugs didn't work. And then eventually they were like, well, it seems like you need a little higher level of care than we can provide you because you call us every day. And so maybe you should just go to the hospital. So I went to the hospital, spent 5 days, 4 or 5 days there. And it was good. It stabilized me. I was actually like comforted by the fact that there were techs walking around to every room every 15 minutes all night long. It like gave me a sense of security that someone would always check on me. So that actually allowed me to sleep. And then I spent another like month and a half in an outpatient program. And then about another year after that in one-on-one counseling and therapy. And in that time, my philosopher brain kind of went on overdrive and started getting a little weird. It got to the point where like I couldn't really discern what was real and what wasn't real. The day I went to the hospital, I wasn't sure if my neighbor who was sitting right in front of me was actually there or just a figment of my imagination, which is weird because I teach Descartes to my students, and Descartes is always, he's the one who says, how do you know you're not dreaming? And I've taught that lesson like to, classrooms full of students, and suddenly I was experiencing it in a way that was visceral and terrifying. That sort of developed, and I was thinking some pretty wacky things. I thought my cousin was going to start a new world religion. I thought the world was coming to an end. I thought lots of now what sound like pretty out there kinds of things. And once, I was able to kind of let the delusions go, get on the right medication, do all that sort of stuff, and eventually, kind of stabilized in therapy and weaned off all the meds and stuff. So for about a year after that, I was incredibly depressed. I was just like, what happened? Like, my entire identity has crumbled here. You know, I was in New York. I was at this great job. I quit my job, moved out here, had a baby, went crazy, lost my mind. Like, it was just like my entire identity fell apart. And that was the story that I was telling. It was just like, I wanted to do this thing. I left New York and I wanted to move to Portland because I just wanted to live in Portland. And I'd never done that before. Just like leave someplace because I didn't want to live there and move someplace else because that's where I wanted to go. And I was like taking a risk by having a kid. That's like the biggest risk ever. And I was taking a risk by trying to take a big leap in my career by working on writing. And it all just seemed to fail. And I just had this story in my mind of like, I went for it and I fell flat on my face in the biggest way you could possibly fall on your face, right? And I remember after telling the story to my therapist for about a year, about a year, 6 months or so, I remember just sitting on my couch one day and saying, this cannot be the end of my story. It was just like, I couldn't think about this experience in a way that was anything but tragic. It was at best, it was like a tragic thing that happened to me. And at worst, it was something that was my fault that I brought on, there was something wrong with me. And neither one of those things were very helpful or empowering or like didn't make me feel good about the experience or about how to move through and past the experience. And so I remember having this moment saying to myself, like, look, I've got to reframe this for myself somehow. I have to turn this experience into something meaningful for me. Or I'm never gonna be able to like live my life. I'm gonna be stuck here in this feeling of depression where I'm crying every day and feeling like my life is falling apart. And so that's when I decided I'd written a short story about my experience. I decided to hold a public reading about it. And I invited people to come and watch me read. And I got 40 people in a room to hear my story. And once I started doing that and sharing it on social media, I had people really start to connect with me. Someone asked me to be a panelist on a survivors, of postpartum psychosis panel. And so I got to talk about that and connect with other people who had been through it and meet people who had been through it like I had. And that started this healing process for me. The other thing that happened was that, this philosophical coaching thing was something that I had thought about doing many, many years ago, but I really didn't, I was sort of like, well, maybe someday. But it was the only thing I could think to do that didn't make me want to cry every day. So I did it. And eventually I said, I wanted to serve new moms in part because of what I went through. And once I started venturing out into that part of my practice, I realized that I really loved it. Not only, because I really resisted the mom thing for a long time. I felt like, no, moms. Like I didn't care about like mommy blogs or like craft projects with your kids. And so I thought I didn't like want to do it. But what I discovered was that actually motherhood for me, was about all these philosophical interests that I found really fascinating: existentialism, Buddhism, feminist philosophy, and this practice sort of found the Venn diagram intersection of all of them. And so suddenly it was like, oh, well, I could use this experience to connect with other people. It fuels my passion for why it's so important to talk to women and mothers about, sort of the changes and identity shifts that come with parenthood. And suddenly this past experience that I had that felt like at best a tragedy was transformed into something that was fuel for my next project. And when I was able to frame it that way, suddenly it started to feel like, oh, well, this now is my purpose, right? This, like, it combines teaching and coaching and talking with women and all of these philosophical interests that I'm interested in, and my experience as a mother, and all of these parts of myself feel integrated and whole in this one thing. And it's like, eureka, I found my purpose. And it seems like it's something that was found. So I say all that not to say like, oh, like just, you know, have a horrific experience and then your purpose will be revealed to you. I say that this story because that moment on the couch was the critical moment when I said, I need to take agency here and figure out what story I'm going to tell myself about this experience. And if I want to tell myself a story about this experience that integrates it into a story of meaning and purpose, I need to do something with this. I need to transform this into a source of connection and meaning and value for my life. And that's when I started turning towards it and started sharing it publicly and started making it the sort of central part of why I do what I do. So one of the underlying ideas there is that, you know, and this comes from Sartre existential philosophy, is that we cannot control what happens to us. A lot of the time, we cannot control what happens to us. But we can control the story that we tell about what happens to us. And I think that that is really important to keep in mind. Okay, so then what is purpose then? In that, you know, given my little case study there, my sense that now I'm like doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and that I found the thing that connects and resonates with all these parts of my life and all of my skills and talents. That purpose, what I think is happening there, the word purpose is actually being given to a coherent and powerful story about my experiences, my values, and my actions, right? I have this past experience as, you know, as a philosopher, as a person who experienced this mental illness, as, you know, the person in the body that I'm in, from the place that I'm at, with the skills that I have and the experiences that I have. And I'm able to integrate those into a story about why I'm doing what I'm doing now and what I value now, right? And it is framed, it's like this creative act. So it is a reframing and a recognition, and by that I mean like a recognition, a rethinking of my past experiences as sources of learning, values, and growth that are integrated into a meaningful story about my present and future actions, right? And so that's what I think purpose is. It is a story that it reframes and integrates our experiences into a source of learning, value, and growth, right? So that what we do now is a way of perpetuating those values, perpetuating the lessons that we've learned, and sharing them. Does that make sense? I'm doing my best to kind of, it's a kind of like abstract way of thinking about it, but I'm hoping that it connects with you. Okay, so one thing I want to say about all this is that, you know, existentialists have this reputation for being kind of missing some of the important aspects of all the forces that push on us, right? They're really into this idea of like freedom, and we can always rewrite our stories, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that we get a lot of external messaging from our culture, from our families, communities, religions, right? All of these sources of meaning. And we get messages about race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, age, appearance, politics, money, blah, 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 like go on and on and on, right? We get all of these sort of these discourses and these messages and these stories from these external sources about all this stuff and about who we are as a person within that framework, right? And so those external messages can shape what we believe is possible for us, what kind of stories we are likely to tell ourselves, and what kind of stories we maybe are able to tell ourselves, right? And so I just want to say that's true, right? It definitely is true, and we don't want to minimize the impact of those external forces on us and our sense of who we are and what we should be doing in the world, right? And those forces, this is just a little like helpful framework, I think, for thinking about where those messages come from, right? Those influences. So there's the individual, right? What you do with all that. Then there's the interpersonal, which is like those messages that come from your family, your like communities, the interpersonal actual contact that you have with other humans, right? Which are limited right now. There's the institutional messages from government, religion, schools, etc. And then there's the ideological messages that we get from culture, those sort of softer messages, right? And they're all incredibly powerful. And when we think about our stories and rewriting our stories, we do it within the context of all of these different forces that influence us. And yet, I think it's important to remember that, and this is a quote from Viktor Frankl, who was a psychotherapist, Jewish psychotherapist, who I think Elizabeth's from your neck of the woods, and he was held in a Nazi concentration camp in Auschwitz. I think it was in Auschwitz, and you know, everything was stripped from him. He was, you know, as people were treated in these horrific conditions. And afterward, he wrote a book about it called Man's Search for Meaning. He survived. And he talks about how the thing that separated the people who made it from those who didn't was often what kind of stories they told themselves about what their suffering meant and how they would be able to think about it in the future. And he says that, you know, between stimulus and response, so between those external messages and those external forces, and even just stimulus as in like your kid picks up the vase and throws it on the ground, right? Stimulus, whatever it is, the stimulus and response, there is space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And so while I don't want to minimize the impact of all those external forces and messages about who we are and who we can be, we also want to recognize that there has to be room for agency for us in there. Because if we think that there's no room for agency, that we are simply products of our programming, then yeah, it's going to be really hard to rewrite your story into one that has, where you feel like you're able to determine what your own sense of purpose is, right? And so I think we need to think about the space that happens, and that's where the revision happens. That's where the reflection happens. That's where you can look back on your past and say, what does this mean? What do I want it to mean? How do I see myself in this, right? And I should say that, you know, we tell ourselves stories all the time. And for, you know, my story that like I had moved across the country, quit my job, had a baby and went crazy, like, and I was a big loser, like that was a story that I was creating too, right? It's not like that was the truth and then I stepped in and said like, no, I gotta like take control of this and rewrite it. That was also my story, right? And so the stories we tell don't have to be positive. We can tell ourselves a story that like we have no purpose and that we don't know what we're doing and that, you know, we're going to wander through our lives like doing meaningless work and always being frustrated. You could tell yourself that story. Or you could tell yourself the story that like your purpose grows and changes and you're sort of doing this now and figuring something else out and you're gonna think about how it all fits together in the long run, right? Like there are different ways to sort of frame this for yourself. So that little bit of space I think is important. Okay. I also want to say, like I said, with those external forces that push on us in terms of messaging, there are also like real limits in terms of like resources. So it will be really hard to rewrite new stories for yourself, like positive, life-affirming, purpose-driven stories for yourself, if you, for example, like lack food, shelter, healthcare, basic safety, and other foundational needs, right? Again, you have Maslow's hierarchy, right? Like you have to have the basics fulfilled, at least in some respect, so that your entire sense of your cognitive framework is not just focused on that, but focused on the ability to kind of understand your experiences, not just be in them. And then, of course, if the external messages you receive do not leave space, they don't include space for revision, right? If part of the programming that you get from the world is you are just stuck with your fate, and or this is your fate, whatever it might be, and you have to do this, or you have to be this, or you can't be that, you're not allowed to be that, and there's nothing you can do about it, it's going to be really hard to find that space between stimulus and response. And so I think when we think about social justice work, we have to recognize that, like, that's what's at stake. That space of agency and the ability that people have to understand and reflect on their own lives and see them as meaningful and purposeful is part of what's at stake here. I only really have a couple more things to say. One of the last things here is that the research and the data suggests that people feel a stronger sense of meaning and purpose when their stories include connection and service to others. And I will say for myself, that was true, right? When I started connecting with others, sharing, and then having women who I'd never met message me on, Facebook and just say, like, thank you so much for sharing your story. I also went through something like this, or I feel like I've been like silent and full of shame about it, and I'm really like glad that you were able to kind of put it out into the light, right? All these things, that connection with people is tends to really give you a stronger sense of meaning and purpose, even for activities that don't obviously have that quality to them. So one example is like, if your job is, a janitor in a hospital, right? If you're cleaning, that might not feel like something that is full of like meaning and purpose. But if you think about it in terms of your connection to the community and in service of others, like if you're cleaning the bathroom in a hospital room because you want the next kid that has cancer to feel safe and clean and like they're in a warm and welcoming environment, then that action is going to feel more meaningful to you, right? So again, it's about what story are you telling yourself about your actions. So in conclusion, purpose does not come from out there, I don't think, in the stars, and it does not come even from in here in some like hidden part of your soul that you have to reveal. It's not found at all. It is deliberately made. It is an act. It's not a discovery. It is a creation. And that's hard. And it takes work, and it takes effort, and it takes will, right? It takes, and it takes confidence to think that you can do that. But that is my suggestion to you. And, oh no, we're gonna skip that one. So, and now I will ask for a volunteer, or if you want to ask questions, if anyone has any questions before we ask for a volunteer, if anyone was willing to volunteer. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment, or write it in the group chat. My hope here is that, in the second half of the class, that we really just treat this like a conversation. And can talk with each other. And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see my face big. You see me big?
So I have a quick question, or hopefully quick. First thing, thanks so much. How do you think like the coronavirus is affecting like the finding of purpose or creating a purpose, and I don't know, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a small thing, right? Like, I think so many of us, it can happen in so many different ways, right? People might have, before coronavirus, like you might have had a job that you felt really good about, and you like felt a strong sense of meaning and purpose, and you went to that job every day and you felt like you were doing your thing, and then suddenly you get laid off. And now it's like, well, now what? You know, like who am I? What is my life about now? What is my purpose? Why do I get up and out of bed every day? I'm not going to go anywhere or see anyone or do anything. And I think that, you know, I mean, you know, they say that like job loss can be as devastating as losing a family member in terms of your mental health. And we have, you know, a global population that all experience simultaneous job loss. So yeah, I think it has a huge impact on people's sense of purpose and meaning. And so, you know, again, I'll just offer what I tell myself. I don't know if this is helpful to other people, but I think I have not lost my job. I have this, you know, business and independent business, but my job has changed, right? I used to meet with clients one-on-one here in my office, and that's not happening now. I used to run like in-person classes and meetups, and that's not happening now, right? So instead of doing this here with you, these classes started a few months ago because this was the only thing that I had to do, right? And I had this idea for a while that I wanted to create an online community space for people. And I was like, oh yeah, well, that'll happen eventually. I'll do my Meaning of Motherhood course online eventually. Well, that circumstances have changed. That has been expedited, right? And so now it's like, well, the way I look at it is, and again, I'm in a place of privilege here, right? My husband still has his job. I still have my job. So I can sort of more easily reframe it in the sense of like, well, it forced me to go online maybe sooner than I would have wanted to, but it actually is kind of getting rid of a lot of the noise for me and really forcing me to focus on just a few things that I can do right now. And so I'm going to focus on those things. I think that if you go from having an employed job to suddenly not, you can feel totally powerless. And then we live in this like gig economy where you're supposed to like be your own brand and, you know, come up with your own YouTube channel or podcast to generate income somehow. And there's a lot of pressure there, right? We also have this cultural mythology that your purpose and your career are synonymous and that you can't find purpose outside of your career. And so I think, you know, you could say, look, this time is put me into a tailspin, but it is really forcing me to figure out what's important to me. It is really forcing me to figure out who I think I am right now. It's really forcing me to experience my mind and myself and my day-to-day life in a different way. It's forcing me to be more present in the moment, or to experience small things of beauty that I can, or to see the story that I'm telling myself about who I am and what my work or my existence means in the world. And I think, you know, there's that old saw that like crisis and opportunity are really kind of the same thing if you view them that way. And so it's really about, again, while understanding the limitations, right? I'm trying not to be a Pollyanna about this, but seeing if you can find that little bit of space, that freedom between the stimulus and the response. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think especially the latter part really touched on me. Like, I haven't lost a job, but just it's this idea of a pause, like, and that feels very existential to me. The idea of pausing and then sort of finding that like, LOL, nothing matters, and you know, and so if that's the case, like, yeah, what is the purpose then of all this?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like that, as you said, even for people who haven't lost their work, but suddenly like all of the other distractions are kind of like changed. And I do think nothing matters. And I think, you know, as an existentialist, I think there is no inherent meaning in the world. I'm kind of a little bit of a nihilist in the sense of like, I don't think there is an inherent meaning in the world. I think we humans assign meaning and values, and we do that individually and collectively, that we decide what matters. We decide where meaning is. We decide, you know, that's everything. And so in a way, it's like nothing matters. And because nothing matters, what you do matters, right? Like everything matters. Like this world and this life and this thing that you have, that's it. That's the whole thing. Like there's nothing beyond this. There's no greater schema that it fits into. It's just what you build or what you do or how you relate to other people or how you exist in the world while you're here in this one wild and precious life. Like that is what matters. And so live it, you know?
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Emily asks, do you find that you have to reassert your story to yourself or to others? Like, how do you handle when the narrative of one pure purpose rears its head? Yeah, so I think that what happens sometimes is that like I tell my story and people are like, oh, that's just like, you really found your purpose. And I'm like, but that's like the opposite of what I'm trying to say, that it's not like I had this horrific experience and then I found my purpose. It's that I like did the cognitive work of creating this story, knowing that I can change it. I mean, I think another thing that Sartre talks about is what he calls the spirit of seriousness, where we sort of, let's say we tell our story of purpose, right? We like do the work of creating this new story, and maybe we even like recognize that we're doing it while we're doing it. It's like an act of creation that we are doing. And then we get really attached to it. We become very serious about this story and about this purpose. And we forget that we were the ones to write it in the first place, right? We forget that like we are the creators, and we take it too seriously. It's like, you know, if you are playing soccer and suddenly you think that like the rules of soccer are like written in the clouds, like they always have been and always will be like real things in the world. And you forget that like humans came up with these rules because it is a game, right? And I think that is the attitude to take with you into this process, is that you came up with this story and actually it's all kind of a game. Right? That it is this experiment. It is this lifelong experiment. And you can experiment with different stories. You can experiment with different purposes. And maybe, you know, I never, ever in a million years thought I would be working on motherhood. Never. And until I became a mother, and then suddenly I had this moment, I was like, oh, everything I've ever cared about is actually about motherhood. I just didn't see it that way. I saw it as, you know, being about like human beings and like the foundational psychology and understanding of the world of humans, but mothers make humans. So like there's an important connection there. And when mothers make humans, they think about the psychology and the personhood of the humans that they're making. And so in relation to themselves. And suddenly it felt like, oh, well, yeah, that totally fits into these other things that I'm interested in a way that brings a lot of coherence to my life. And to, you know, I can integrate all these different parts of myself into this single story. And so, but I don't for a minute think that there could be something that happens in my life that will upend everything and change it again, right? Maybe I will get into a car accident and become a quadriplegic, and then suddenly my life will be about something else, right? Maybe I'll win the lottery and then my life will be about something else. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in my life. Maybe there'll be another global pandemic and then my life will be about something else. Like there's always, we can't control those external forces. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control the story we tell about what happens to them. And so when you understand that, I think those external things feel less scary because you have confidence in your ability to integrate them into your life. Instead of, oh, I have my neat little story here and this is my purpose and I'm doing this thing. And if something comes in from the outside, it's just gonna ruin everything. It's gonna knock down all my pins, and I'm gonna have to like, you know, figure out what to do with the mess, right? And instead, you can say like, yeah, well, sometimes a bowling ball comes and knocks down all your pins, and then you gotta like rearrange your pins or like play a different sport or something, right? Like you have to integrate it in a way that that allows you to always see your experiences as a growth process. And you don't have to, like, that's what I recommend, right? That you can integrate them into a story of growth and learning and development, self-realization. That's the story I'm pretty attached to. And that's the story that I think probably makes life easier. But if you want a story of like failure and, you know, worthlessness, and you feel really attached to that story, like, go for it. It probably won't make for a very happy and fulfilling life. Does anyone want, we've got some time, does anyone want to be our guinea pig and get more extensive coaching? Some purpose thing that you were struggling with? Maybe you were at a moment in your life where you were kind of at a crossroads or dealing with something challenging. I'm going to give you all a minute to see if anything pops up in the chat. All right, any more questions? Oh, hi, Emily.
I was gonna say I'm a little too scared to like go in front of everyone, but this is very helpful, and it answered my question. I think sometimes the one purpose idea also comes from our family of origin. So I was just thinking about that, where in terms of vocation and career, there's like often a singular story from my family about what I should do. And so I have to sort of push back against that, I'm thinking, when it arises. So that's very helpful to think about it as integrating pandemics and all kinds of things.
Yeah, like I said, I think it makes you feel more resilient and flexible, right? When you think about it that way, because it allows you to say yes to whatever happens, you know? It allows you to say yes in a way that that makes that thing meaningful. And I will say that a lot of times the things that are most meaningful for people and most powerful in the stories that they tell tend to be the things that are most disruptive at the time, you know, because those are the moments of impact.
Do you have any ideas on like process or like just like activities for like helping think through the creation of purpose?
It's a good question. I think that yes. Okay, so one is a book that I would recommend. It is called, I'm sure many of you have heard of it, The Artist's Way, by this woman named Julia Cameron. And she had a 12-week course that she then put into book form. And the course is, I think the book's subtitle is something like Recovering Your Creative Self or something like that. But if you don't think of yourself as creative or aspiring to creativity, don't worry about it. It's not really just about that. I think she defines that very broadly. It's really about finding your sense of meaning and purpose in your life, I think. And so some of the things that she recommends to do in the book are things that, so one is something she calls morning pages, which is every morning for the 12 weeks, you write 3 handwritten pages first thing in the morning, which is kind of a lot. It takes like a good 30 minutes if you're gonna do it. And she said, don't even think of it as writing, just think of it as like a brain dump. Because what ends up happening is that, and she invites you to like put all of your like most petty and ridiculous things down. What ends up happening is that you start seeing the same things show up over and over again. And like suddenly you start to realize like, one, maybe you're tired of complaining about your life in the same way over and over again. And two, then you start to see some common themes. And so that I think can help give direction when you feel like you don't have any. And I think that's a good practice to do regardless, but that's one thing. And then the other thing that she has you do throughout the 12 weeks is what she calls an artist date, which is each week you take yourself on a date. And right now that would be harder to do. Although I think in these warmer months, you can find ways to do it. And it means that you, by yourself, no one is allowed to come with you, must go out into the world and do something that you find interesting. You're following your curiosities, you're following your interests, and you do it for about 2 hours a week. And it's like, it could be, like you go to a guitar shop and like look at the guitars. If guitar is something you're interested in, right? And you do that throughout the 12 weeks. And then each week she sort of organizes it by theme and has you do certain activities and writing exercises to kind of, think about. And some of them are things like, imagine 5 different lifetimes or 5 different lives that you could have. You have your current life, and then you could have 5 others. What is in those 5 other lives? And you just sort of like write a bunch down. And then maybe your homework is like, pick one and incorporate it into your artist date this week, right? So maybe like your thing is like, I would be a food critic, right? And so like maybe your artist date is that you like take yourself on a date to a nice restaurant or something, right? Or you go and like learn to make gnocchi from your grandma or whatever it might be, right? And so that's a book that I would recommend just as like a kind of self-contained, if you want like a bunch of activities to do that. I find it really well thought out and helpful. I think the other important thing is to figure out what is the story that you are telling yourself now about your purpose, right? And I think that's part of what the morning pages writing is helpful with, is like, what is the story you're telling yourself? And even journaling for 20 minutes with the prompt, the story I'm telling myself is, right? Like, I think Brene Brown has recently made that phrase popular, right? The story I'm telling myself is, and just, set a timer for 10 minutes and just like see what comes up, or set a timer for 20 minutes and see what comes up. And seeing if you can figure out like, what are the thoughts that I'm having about my sense of purpose and my existence and the meaning in the world. And then you can ask yourself a series of questions. And the first class online I taught like this was called Crisis Meets Curiosity. In that class, I outlined some like really helpful questions that you can ask yourself. So the 4 basic ones are like, all right, so if this is my story or this is my thought, you can ask yourself like, is this thought true? Right? Can I absolutely know that this thought is true? That's the second thing, right? And the goal there is just like to just insert a little bit of doubt in your story, right? Because the thing is, we get so attached to these stories that we don't even realize that they're stories. We don't even realize that they could be false, right? That they may not reflect the truth, right? As Tara Brach says, first thing is like, please don't believe your thoughts. That's like her number 1 piece of advice is like, please don't believe your thoughts. They're real in that they exist. They are thoughts, but they're not true often, right? So is it true? Can I absolutely know that it's true? And then the third one is, what is the impact of this story that I'm telling on me, on my life, on my relationship to the world, to others in my life, my relationship to my work, my relationship to my children? What is the impact? And not to berate yourself, right? This is not like piling guilt on or like, it's so easy for us to just like, I'm a terrible person because I think this thing, and then it has all these terrible consequences, and look at how bad I am, right? Like the goal here is just to see. It's just to see. And again, to insert a little bit more of that space. And then the fourth question is, who would I be or how would I feel without this story, or without this thought? To imagine what it would be like if you didn't have this thought. And I think what happens is, you know, even if we're not able to let the story go, the more we can see what it would be like if we didn't hold so tightly to these stories, and the more we can see what it is like when we do, it's like putting your hand on a hot stove. Like when I do this, it hurts, right? And so if I didn't do this, it wouldn't hurt so much. And so you just like, you stop believing the old story, not because you're a bad person for believing it or you're blameworthy, whatever, but just because it hurts. And if you like lift your hand off, and it doesn't hurt so much. That's all. You just understand the difference between what hurts and what doesn't, right? And so you realize that without this story, and if I have this other story, this story that is more life affirming, more full of resilience, more full of meaning, more full of connection and compassion, that doesn't hurt so much. And that it allows me to have more energy for the work, that it allows me to feel more present in my life, that it allows me to feel happier, etc. You know? And I might add a fifth thing there, which is, you know, so the third one is, what's the impact of this story? How would I feel without this story? And then maybe imagine, you know, what does an alternative story look like? Right? And maybe outline some of the features of what that alternative story looks like and how it would feel, and how, not that you necessarily know how to get from here to there, because you don't always know how to get from here to there, but just allow yourself to even be open to the possibility that you could, right? That other version is possible for you. And I think, again, slowly over time, you start to see what hurts and what doesn't. It was a very long answer to your question, Rob, but thoughts? Might be gone.
I'm here, sorry. Yeah, that's good. I'll have to look into that and try those things.
Yeah. Thanks. Anyone else?
This makes me think of how we also ask other people like what their purpose is in life, or when they come to us and maybe try to discuss this topic. I can think of many friends in the past just growing up trying to figure out, what should I do with my life? And a lot of people still don't know. So I'm wondering, you know, I think it's important now, after an insight that hearing you talk, is not to put that pressure on other people, because, you know, some people feel like they have found their purpose, and as you has recommended that we have already created our purpose, but how could we encourage others to do the same without maybe putting that pressure on them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we certainly, again, because our culture often equates some certain things, right? That purpose is sort of synonymous with career, and that career is synonymous with like value, worth, and success, right? And so the collapsing of all those things together, I think, is part of the reason that the first question anybody asks at a party is, what do you do? Right? So I think it is worth at least introducing the possibility to people to disentangle some of those things, right? It's part of why I'm not like, my daughter's 4.5, and she's still pretty young, but you know, when we're kids, everyone asks us all the time, what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? It's like the question that like adults know to ask children for some reason, right? And I think that is from a very young age, this sort of like, you got to find the thing. If you don't find the one thing, then you're not doing it right, right? And so that's just something to be mindful of. It's just like, look, we're humans. Life is long, right? Like things happen and you do things for a while and they are meaningful and they feel full of purpose. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And you can sort of, you know, do your best there. And so I guess that is like the way that I try and talk about it, you know, with my kiddo and with other people. And particularly like younger people who are in these moments of transition, right? Out of high school or out of college, where it's just like, okay, this is the rest of your life. This is the real world. You got to pick it right now, right? And just reminding them that like people change careers, like, I don't know, average of like 6 times over the course of their, maybe more. And so that, because that narrative of like the one thing that I just need to find and then I will know is comforting, right? Because it has certainty to it. It has security. This idea that like, if you just find the one thing and you do the one thing, you'll get life right. You know, like you will be successful at life. And when we suggest that actually like, it changes a lot and it can go up and down a bunch of different ways, people don't like that because it feels uncomfortable, it feels uncertain. You know, and so I think just kind of trying to bring some normalization and acceptance of the uncertainty and of our like really endless capacity to reframe our stories, right? Like to me, that is feels very powerful that we have this capacity to reframe our stories. And again, take some of the pressure off. So I guess that is another thing I'd emphasize.
Thank you.
All right, well, if there's no more questions or comments, I suppose we'll end a little bit early. Thank you all so very much for coming and joining me today on this, well, it's afternoon here, Elizabeth. I know that it's night where you are, but this summer afternoon, evening, whatever time zone you're in. I appreciate you spending the time with me. And I wanted to share that next month, get you back on my screen share because I'll tell you next month's topic. So next month is the existential crisis of parenthood, my favorite topic. So that will be the second Sunday of August, as most of these have been. And yes, I think that's it. Feel free to reach out to me. My contact information. If you have questions, comments, you want more, you can come to my website, danielasusa.com. I have videos and blog posts and all sorts of things. You can, ask me questions about my work. If you want to work with me, if you want to know more about my Meaning of Motherhood course, I'll be teaching it again in October. So there's more information there. And I'll be teaching it online for the first time because I'm pivoting. Again, thank you so much for coming, and don't hesitate to reach out with me, and I hope to see you again here next month.